Now I'd like to introduce the moderator for our plenary discussion, Chartering Turns 20, Producing a Record of Success in the Next 20 Years of Charter School Authorizing. A highly respected education analyst, Mike Petrilli is Executive Vice President of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is a charter authorizer in Ohio and a NACSA member. At Fordham, Mike oversees research projects and publications, and you, of course, may know him from his Flypaper blog and the Education Gadfly newsletter. He's also a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and executive editor of Education Next. Mike previously served in the Office of Innovation and Improvement at the U.S. Department of Education. And if Mike isn't busy enough, he is also the father of two boys, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. Mike.
Okay, is this on? Yes, okay. Good morning. First of all, please join me again in thanking Greg for that great opening comments and his leadership. We have a phenomenal panel here today, and the reason that we have such a great panel is that the people that are going to be speaking believe deeply in authorizing, and they also believe deeply in Greg Richmond. His leadership in this movement has been critical, this voice consistently for quality, and we really appreciate it. All of us do, Greg, what you do around the country. All right, we are going to now bring up our panel. I understand there may be some music, so we can, we're going to pump up the volume, baby. Here we go for this excellent opening panel. Only in the charter school movement do we celebrate a birthday, 20 years in this case, by having a panel to talk about our strengths and our weaknesses and our failures. That's what we're about, is quality and accountability. So let's join our panel. First up, Dr. Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy at the American Enterprise Institute. Come on up, Rick. Look alive, Rick, look alive. Okay, next up we have Jim Peyser, partner at the NewSchools Venture Fund. Yes. Take a seat. Good. Coming up on stage again, Greg Richmond, your beloved leader, NACSA. We have Nina Rees, the new leader of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. And finally, Jed Wallace, the leader of the California Association of Charter Schools. Come on up, Jed. That's fine. Okay. No music. We're going to have to make our own music. There is going to be singing. That'll happen later. Okay. Whew. Now, these chairs are a challenge for some of us who are vertically challenged. I was telling Lisa I was afraid my feet might dangle. That's going to make me look about 12. So thankfully, but they are kind of comfortable. Those of you who were out last night to dinner know that I had a full rack of ribs that was about this wide. So and these chairs are kind of comfortable. So I'm going to fight hard the urge to take a nap. I'll do that later because these are nice and comfortable. All right. So we have about an hour today to talk about some of the big issues in charter schools, what lessons we've learned over the past 20 years, and what we need to do going forward. I've given these folks a little bit of a chance to know what some of the questions are, but we're also going to mix it up and just see where this conversation goes. All right. Let's start first on a positive note. Greg just gave us a challenge, 1 million students, 1 million children, to create schools for these kids. So let's talk first about replicating success. For all the challenges, and we'll talk about this in a minute in terms of failure, we have some phenomenal charter schools out there that you all have authorized and work with. And the question is, how can we scale up success? How can we accelerate that scaling up so that we can reach this goal of building more of these schools for the million kids that we want to serve going forward? So let's talk about that. Let's start with Jim, if you will. What is it? What are you talk about this sometimes, the big rocks that are in the way. What do we need to do if we're really going to accelerate the movement towards high-quality schools going forward?
Well, at one level, I think as authorizers in particular, we need to sort of balance the natural tendency to be skeptics about applicants that are coming forward seeking charters from us, because this is a sort of a scarce resource and it's our responsibility to make sure that it is allocated wisely and well, with the mission to grow the sector, to make change, to serve as many students as we can, and to change the system of public education for the better. which means that there is some tension between encouraging successful charters to grow and ensuring that we also maintain our responsibilities to the taxpayers and to the children and families for holding high standards of accountability and not just allowing sort of anyone to come in the door. But I think we've sort of, in general, have gotten the balance a bit wrong, meaning that we've been too focused on treating all comers, all applicants, the same, even though some are coming in with very significant track records of proven success over time with students. So I think we need to be more focused in those cases where we're talking about replicating high performers or letting high performers go to scale, of focusing on their outcomes, focusing on their results, and treating that as an entryway into more opportunity for serving more students, which might mean a streamlined process for getting a charter. It may mean, in some cases, allowing charters to be granted sort of multiple charters to be granted all at once, or to allow a growth path over time, rather than treat each school individually one at a time as they come. So I think there's some things around chartering itself which can be changed in some way in order to facilitate the scaling of high performers. There are other things, though, obviously, that get in the way, and this is where a lot of the influence and power resides outside of the authorizer, not always, but frequently outside of the authorizer's purview, and that is in making available to high-performing charters facilities and other resources that make it possible for them to grow more rapidly than they otherwise would be able to do. Everybody struggles with facilities, just as an example, and maybe the prime example to be sure. Everybody struggles with that. But for those organizations that are proven, for those that are committing to go to larger scale, trying to figure out proactively how to resolve some of those issues, how to work in partnership with school districts and state agencies and others in order to make that more viable, I think is a critical component to making it possible for high performers to get to scale and get there as quickly as possible.
All right, great. Now, Greg, you talked about people as one part of your strategy, and I want to bring in Jed here from California. We know that developing talent in this sector is something that we have to continue to do. You spent time in the traditional public school sector, and you've talked at times about how we can try to tap the latent talent that is in that sector and bring them into the charter school world, both in the authorizing world as well as operating charter schools. How do we do that? How do we bridge those two sectors?
So I think it's a great question. I think my thoughts on it are shaped by the fact that I've spent roughly as much time within the traditional system as I have within the charter school space. And my family, both my parents spent more than 30 years in public education. So I'm just constantly thinking about whether or not the reform community is striking the right balance in terms of appreciation of the amount of talent that is within the traditional system. My own personal view is that reformers aren't appreciating enough, that there's way more there to tap into. The question is, how do we do it? And my sense is that there are some new possibilities that are arising. I'll just give a couple of examples from California that I know about. There are now a couple of charter schools in California that have a track record of success, that have had new or traditional public schools convert into them, to come under the umbrella of that charter management organization. And so here's an example of where you see talent coming from the traditional system put within a healthier context. It's more set up for success from the very beginning. We've also seen, this is one that I've personally been pushing on, and I'm intrigued to see that there's some progress. I think that, for example, if you were to look at John Dacey, Los Angeles Unified School District Superintendent, imagine how phenomenal of a CMO that guy could operate if we could get him all of the freedom and the flexibility that you would get from charter school status. There is now a few superintendents that are creating basically their own 501c3s that are subsidiary to their school districts, and they are basically starting their own charter organizations. They're starting within their own district, and it makes sense for them to do so. But what I really am eager for is that day when the entrepreneurial spirit of these great superintendents leads them to seek a charter in the next district over. In California, we have Prop 39, which is a way for charter schools to request facilities from their operators. I say that the day that we have really arrived is the day when school districts are Prop 39ing one another, and we have a real whole other level of entrepreneurialism happening within the sector.
Okay. Rick, you've written a lot about the role of for-profits in the education reform space. There's been, I would say, a lot of concern within the charter school movement about whether the for-profit operators have been committed to quality. Certainly that's been an issue in Ohio. Yet, at the same time, you've said that, look, for-profits have the capacity, because they can raise capital, to scale up. That in other sectors, that it is particularly because of the profit motive that people know how to raise that capital and go to scale, that we can't do as well in the nonprofit sector. So is there a role here for the for-profits? And how do we make sure they're incentivized then to focus on quality?
Sure, yes, there is a role for for-profits. Part of the problem, one of the big obstacles is how unimaginative and tepid we tend to be. You look at Mitch Price's work, for instance, at Center for Reinventing Public Ed, looking at how charter schools actually use the talent at their disposal. We tend to use it remarkably like the districts do. If you have a terrific fourth grade reading instructor, they tend to teach reading to 28 kids for 90 minutes a day. It's exactly what you would see if you walk down the street. There is little evidence when you look across the breadth and width of American charter schooling that we are actually thinking differently about how do you use scarce talent, about how do you make sure you're getting the best use out of the people at your disposal. What there's a lot of evidence is that the good charter schools are just good at going out and getting more talent, but then using it pretty much burning the rubber off it and just figuring out they'll be able to get TFA to bring in some more. What for-profits do in any line of work is both good and bad stuff. The reason that we distrust for-profits is because they have an incentive to cut corners and to deceive us into buying their product. That's part of the nature of a for-profit. Their responsibility is to maximize return on investment. The flip side of those frailties, though, is that for-profits have an incentive to grow as rapidly as possible, and they have an incentive to squeeze cost structures. And the most significant way you squeeze cost structure is by figuring out how to let 9 people do what 10 people used to be needed to do. So I think there is really no alternative. If we don't look to for-profits, if we continue to look to CMOs that we're all very proud of, KIPP has taken 18 years to get to 30,000 kids served. Go ahead and plot the projections on your napkin. We're going to be sitting here in the 2500s and still talking about millions and millions of kids who are not being served. In that same span, any number of for-profits have grown like crazy. But for that to be healthy and good for kids, we've got to make sure we get the rules of the road right. The incentives have to be that for-profits are delivering quality, not just delivering bodies. The incentives have to shut down people who are doing a lousy job of serving kids. And what we have to focus on at the end of the day is not somebody's tax status, but whether or not they are spending public dollars to serve the public's children well.
And Rick, is there a way, if we are focused, so that's the for-profit, on the nonprofit side, is there a way to encourage the KIPPs of the world and the others to grow faster? I mean, is that a smart thing to do? Or what's holding it back? More philanthropy, what?
So there's a couple trade-offs here. One philanthropy tends to prefer the tried and true. So TFA's cost per recruit now, not salary, just cost per recruit is $40,000 to $45,000 a head. TFA is about the only giant success story I know of in the last 20 years, which costs more per person 20 years in than it did at the start. It's just a crazy model. It's because philanthropists say, we love what you're doing, we want you to do all of it plus, rather than trying to look at where do you actually shave costs. This is familiar to anybody in the CMO game. Nobody says, we want 80% of Yes or Aspire or Uncommon for 50% of the price. They say we want 100% for 120% the price. So we have a philanthropy model which actually supports building on new cost structures and fights against efficiency, and that makes it harder to take these models to scale. I was talking to Mike Feinberg a couple months back for my new book. Mike said, look, let's be honest. Recruiting the 125th Kipster was actually not that hard. Recruiting the 850th was a bear. There's only so much talent out there. And if our models are presume that we are going to recruit thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people to do the same job really well, we're just hitting a wall. So the real opportunities, I mean, I think, Jed referred to, kind of a John Daisy going outside in terms of chartering. Hell, I would be real happy if these guys use the flexibility currently at their disposal. When Dan Weisberg went to New York City to work with Joel Klein, he kept hearing that you needed to get 5 evaluations in order to be able to remove an ineffective teacher. Not true. You needed 1. It wasn't even the union that was putting out this untruth. It was the city's own general counsels who had become so risk averse that they were willing to let lousy educators stay in classrooms with kids rather than actually go ahead and exploit their... So a lot of this is about mindset, and I'm actually not all that sure we've got the mindset right in charter schooling. I know way too many charter schools that are leaving a whole lot of low-hanging fruit because they're running schools and using teachers the way we always have rather than pushing against the bounds to see what can we do with what we've got to serve kids best.